COVID-19, China medical supply chains and broader trade issues. Updated December 23, 2020. The outbreak of coronavirus disease 2019 (COVID-19), first in China, and then globally, including in the United States, has drawn attention to the ways in which the U.S. economy depends on manufacturing and supply chains based in China. This report aims to assess current developments and identify immediate and longer-range China trade issues for Congress. An area of particular concern to Congress has been U.S. shortages in medical supplies, including personal protective equipment (PPE) and pharmaceuticals, as the United States stepped up efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic with limited domestic stockpiles and insufficient U.S. industrial capacity. Because of China's role as a global supplier of PPE, medical devices, antibiotics, and active pharmaceutical ingredients, reduced exports from China led to shortages of critical medical supplies in the United States. Exacerbating the situation, in early February 2020, the Chinese government nationalized control of the production and distribution of medical supplies in China, directing all production for domestic use, and directed the bureaucracy and Chinese industry to secure supplies from the global market. Once past the initial peak of its COVID-19 outbreak, the Chinese government appears to have prioritized certain countries and selectively released some medical supplies for overseas delivery. Congress has enacted legislation to better understand and address U.S. medical supply chain dependencies, including PL 116-136, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security (CARES) Act, that includes several provisions to expand drug shortage reporting requirements, require certain drug manufacturers to draw up risk management plans, require the U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA) to maintain a public list of medical devices that are determined to be in shortage, and direct the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to conduct a study of pharmaceutical supply chain security. Other potential considerations for Congress include whether and how to further incentivize additional production of health supplies, diversify production, address other supply chain dependencies, for example, microelectronics, fill information and data gaps, and promote U.S. leadership on global health and trade issues. The crisis that emerged for the U.S. economy was defined, in large part, by a collapse of critical supply, as well as a sharp downturn in demand, first in China and now in the United States and globally. As China's manufacturing sector has recovered, while the United States and other major global markets are still grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic, some fear China could overwhelm overseas markets, as it ramps up export-led growth. China is also seeking to make gains in strategic sectors, such as telecommunications, microelectronics, and semiconductors, in which the government undertook extraordinary measures to sustain research and development and manufacturing during the COVID-19 outbreak in China. Contents. Overview. 1. U.S.-China trade and the impact of COVID-19. 2. China first quarter Q1 2020 slowdown effects on U.S. industries. 4. Transportation, logistics and broader considerations. 6. Prospects for U.S. exports. 9. Force majeure provisions. 10. U.S. reliance on China for healthcare and medical products. 11. China nationalizes medical production and supply. 15. Implications of China's export constraints. U.S. shortages and policy response. 20. U.S. shortages. 26. Global trade restrictions. 32. Domestic supply, U.S. versus foreign-made products. 34. China's economic recovery, prospects and implications. 37. China positioning to export. 39. Steel overcapacity. 40. Export VAT rebate. 40. China pushing ahead in strategic sectors. 42. Issues for Congress. 46. Dependency of U.S. healthcare supply chains on China. 46. Other U.S. supply chain dependencies. 50. U.S. market competitiveness and tariff policy. 51. Information and data gaps. 51. Unique role of the U.S. federal government. 54. U.S. leadership on global medical trade. 54. Figures. Figure 1. U.S.-China trade in 2019. 4. Figure 2. U.S. imports of pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, products, and supplies in 2019. 12. Figure 3. U.S. import and exports of select medical products in 2019. 14. Figure 4. China's export of select COVID-19 related products, January to October 2020. 22. Figure 5. China's exports of select COVID-19 related products, 23. Figure 6. China's API exports by volume and value, 2019, 31. Figure 7. China's API export destinations based on value, 2019, 32. Figure 8. China raw steel production, 2000 to 2019, 40. Figure 9. China's industrial priorities, 2015 to 2025, 42. Tables. Table 1. Select U.S. imports from China in 2019, 12. Table 2. Change in China's exports and imports of select medical products, 16. Table 3. U.S. imports from China in 2019, COVID-19 related medical supplies, 18. Table 4. Top partners, value of China's exports of select COVID-19 related medical goods, 23. Table 5. Select Section 301 tariff exclusions on select U.S. imports from China, 28. Table 6. Estimate of the imported share of U.S. domestic supply, select medical-related manufactured good categories in 2018. 35. Table 7. China's export VAT rebates, March 2020, 9% to 13%, 41. Appendixes. Appendix U.S. imports of select medical products, 56. Contacts. Author information, 56. Overview. The outbreak of coronavirus disease 2019 COVID-19, first in the People's Republic of China (PRC) or China, and now globally, including in the United States, has drawn attention to the ways in which the United States and other economies depend on critical manufacturing and global value chains that rely on production based in China. Congress has been particularly concerned about these dependencies and has passed legislation to better understand and address them. An area of particular concern to Congress in the current environment has been U.S. shortages of medical supplies, including personal protective equipment (PPE) and pharmaceuticals, as the United States steps up efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic with limited domestic stockpiles and insufficient U.S. industrial capacity. Because of China's role as a global supplier of PPE, medical devices, antibiotics, and active pharmaceutical ingredients (API), reduced exports from China led to shortages of critical medical supplies in the United States. 1. Starting in early February 2020, U.S. healthcare experts began warning of a likely global spread of COVID-19, and early reports of U.S. medical supply shortages began to emerge. At the same time, the Chinese government nationalized control of the production and distribution of medical supplies in China, directing all production for domestic use. 2. The Chinese government also directed the national bureaucracy, local governments, and Chinese industry to secure supplies from the global market. 3. This effort likely exacerbated medical supply shortages in the United States and other countries, particularly in the absence of domestic emergency measures that might have locked in domestic contracts, facilitated an earlier start to alternative points of production, and restricted exports of key medical supplies. As China's manufacturing sector recovers while the United States and other countries are still grappling with COVID-19, the Chinese government appears to have prioritized certain countries for overseas delivery of medical supplies. Those decisions appear to have been driven, at least in part, by political calculations. 4. COVID-19 was identified in China in December 2019 and peaked in late January 2020. In response, China shut down a large part of its economy in an effort to contain the outbreak. A key factor in the sharp economic slowdown in China was the dramatic downturn of both demand and supply after Chinese officials imposed restrictions in the third week of January on movement of people and goods in and out of localities across China. When the COVID-19 outbreak in China eased, the Chinese government's efforts to restart business activities were slow and uneven across sectors and locations. Companies sought to meet new government requirements for virus containment and faced worker and supply shortages as interregional logistics remained somewhat constrained. 5. Resumption of bilateral trade between the United States and China was uneven due to persistent bottlenecks in inputs, the location of container shipments, and logjams in current shipments. U.S. companies typically maintain anywhere from 2 to 10 weeks of inventory, and transportation time for trans-Pacific container shipments is typically 3 weeks. With this time frame in mind, initial shortages that U.S. firms faced of deliveries of microelectronics, auto parts, and health and medical products intensified once inventory was depleted. There were additional shortages in a wide range of imports that transit via container ship, for example, processed raw materials, intermediate industrial goods, and finished consumer products. As China's economic activities have resumed, many other countries around the world are still taking an economic hit. Restrictions around the world on the movement of people and business operations have prolonged slowdowns in demand, transportation, and logistics worldwide, further dragging down prospects for global trade recovery. Suppressed global demand will likely further complicate efforts to orchestrate a full rebound in economic activity in China or the world. In sectors where China maintains excess capacity, such as steel, some fear China could overwhelm overseas markets as it ramps up export-led growth to compensate for the sharp economic downturn in the first quarter of 2020. China's exports increased by over 20% in November 2020, over November 2019, led by exports of PPE, consumer electronics, and other consumer goods. Congress faces choices that will influence the longer-range U.S. trade trajectory vis-a-vis China. Since the imposition of Section 301 tariffs on U.S. imports from China and China's retaliatory tariffs beginning in 2018, some members have raised questions about the dependence of U.S. supply chains on China for critical products. There are also concerns some have raised about the potential ramifications of these dependencies, particularly in times of crisis or PRC nationalization of industry. Demand pressures during the COVID-19 pandemic could increase U.S. reliance on certain medical supplies from China, provided that the Chinese government is willing to export these supplies to the United States. At the same time, these pressures have also been incentivizing diversification efforts as governments and firms re-evaluate the risks of basing substantial portions of their supply chains in China. U.S.-China trade and the impact of COVID-19. As the United States' third-largest trading partner in 2019, bilateral trade with China is important to the U.S. economy, and the recent sharp downturn in activity affects a wide range of U.S. industries. Total U.S. trade with the world, the sum of exports and imports of goods and services, was $5.6 trillion in 2019, equivalent to 26% of U.S. gross domestic product, GDP. China accounts for 11% of U.S. trade. 6. Key facts about the relationship include the following. 7. China's total merchandise trade with the United States in 2019 amounted to $558.9 billion. China is the United States' third-largest export market for goods. U.S. goods exports to China in 2019 were valued at $106.6 billion in 2019. China is the top source of U.S. imports. U.S. goods imports from China reached $452.2 billion in 2019. U.S. services exports to China in 2019 were valued at $56.7 billion, mostly travel and transport. U.S. services imports from China in 2019 were valued at $18 billion, about half of this amount was travel and transport. U.S. foreign direct investment (FDI) stock in China in 2018 reached $116.5 billion, while China's FDI stock in the United States reached $60.2 billion in 2018. Top U.S. exports to China include semiconductor chips, devices, parts and manufacturing machines, agriculture, aircraft, turbojets, turbopropellers, and gas turbines, optical and medical equipment, autos, plastics, and pharmaceutical products. Figure 1. And top U.S. imports from China include microelectronics, computers and cell phones, and appliances, furniture, bedding and lighting, toys, games and sports equipment, plastics, knitted and non-knitted apparel, textile fabric, linens, and footwear, auto parts, articles of iron and steel, medical and surgical instruments, and organic chemicals including active pharmaceutical ingredients and antibiotics. Figure 1. U.S.-China trade in 2019. Note, dashed portion of the bar depicts a subset of the product category. China first quarter Q1 2020 slowdown effects on U.S. industries. Beginning in late January, the outbreak of COVID-19 in China had a direct economic impact on U.S. firms that operate in China, export to or sell goods and services directly in China, or depend on Chinese goods and services for their operations in the United States and abroad. Some analysts estimate that China experienced a sharp drop in economic growth by as much as 9% in Q1 2020 and a 17.2% drop in exports in January to February 2020, compared to the same period in 2019. 8. China's economy is globally connected through trade, investment, and tourism. The economic slowdown and global spread of COVID-19, combined with global travel and transportation restrictions and other effects, caused worldwide economic fallout. Indicators in key industries included: China recorded a sharp downturn in microelectronics production and sales, and the United States could experience a similar drop due to a potential gap in availability. Almost half the value of U.S. imports from China in 2019 was mobile phones, computers and related parts. Foxconn, a Taiwan firm that produces the iPhone for Apple in China, received formal government permission to reopen its facilities in mid-February, but faced challenges because of quarantine and transportation restrictions. Foxconn said it paid $1,000 to each returning worker to address potential concerns about returning to work. The company also may have faced supply constraints of key microelectronics inputs. 9. Other companies that use Foxconn for contract manufacturing in China include Amazon, Cisco, Dell, Google, Hewlett-Packard, Nintendo, and Sony, as well as Chinese firms Huawei and Xiaomi. 10. The U.S. auto industry and manufacturers in South Korea, Japan, and Germany quickly faced manufacturing bottlenecks because of the lack of availability of auto parts supplies from China. The spread of COVID-19 to other major auto manufacturing markets, including the United States, Germany, Japan and South Korea, imposed additional constraints on auto manufacturing and sales. China exported $9.6 billion in auto parts to the United States in 2019. U.S. manufacturing faced potential shortages of intermediate inputs for steelmaking and heavy manufacturing, such as refined manganese metal, ferrosilicon, and ferrovanadium. Manganese and ferrovanadium are steel strengtheners that depend on China-based processing. While manganese is mined around the world, China controls 97% of manganese processing. Ferrosilicon is used to extract oxygen from liquid steel, and is mostly produced in China. 11. China exported almost $10 billion in iron and steel products to the United States in 2019. U.S. retailers, tourism, and service providers that rely on the Chinese consumer base also took a hit in China. Many closed or significantly curtailed operations. U.S. retailers reduced operating hours or shuttered stores in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. 12. For example, Starbucks closed about half its 4,200 retail outlets in China between late January and late February. 13. Retailers and tourism service providers around the world have seen significantly reduced revenue as fewer Chinese citizens travel abroad. China's outbound tourism spending in 2018 was $277 billion, of which an estimated $36 billion was in the United States. 14. Transportation, logistics and broader considerations. Measures to contain the COVID-19 outbreak significantly curtailed global transportation links, preventing the transport of many products and manufacturing inputs. Passenger air traffic has slowed significantly, taking offline significant air cargo capacity for microelectronics and other products that ship by air. Container shipments also have been constrained by a backlog and dependence on domestic trucking and rail transportation, as well as on the ability of countries to staff port operations. U.S. airlines started suspending flights to China in late January 2020 and have suspended other routes as COVID-19 has spread globally. United Airlines announced steep flight cuts and said in early March 2020 that ticket bookings were down 70% for Asia-Pacific flights, noting that this downturn was magnified by a surge in flight cancellations. The company noted that revenue in April and May could drop as much as 70%. 15. While Federal Express (FedEx) and United Parcel Service (UPS) announced in early March that they continue to run flights in and out of affected countries, they warned that limitations on travel could delay some shipments, although freight carriers are now starting to repurpose passenger flights for cargo, helping to expand capacity. 16. Quarantine of aircrew and restrictions on the ground in China with regard to labor, production, supply and logistics likely significantly curtailed shipments. On March 26, 2020, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, CAAC, restricted all airlines running passenger flights in and out of China to one flight per week, further constraining air freight capacity. 17. In September 2020, CAAC announced the resumption of direct flights to Beijing from 8 countries including Cambodia, Canada, Denmark, Greece, Sweden, and Thailand. Additionally, domestic passenger volumes in China appear to have reached 90% of pre-pandemic levels. 18. Further recovery in air travel could lead to increased air freight capacity for shipments to and from China. 19. Container shipping from China faced serious logjams because of shortages of workers and trucking constraints. These logjams affected both U.S. imports to and exports from China. The Port of Los Angeles announced shipment cuts by 25% that were scheduled from China between February and April 2020. 1 in 9 Southern California jobs is tied to the ports, including people who work on the docks, drive trucks, and move boxes in warehouses, according to the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles. 20. In March 2020, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey requested $1.9 billion in federal aid to offset a forecasted 30% year-on-year drop in cargo volumes, and requested $3 billion the following July to offset revenue losses stemming from a sharp decline in passenger volumes. 21. Shipping and logistical constraints slowed U.S. exports to Asia. U.S. exporters of meat, poultry, hay, oranges and other produce reported in March 2020 that refrigerated containers were in short supply and cold storage facilities were overflowing with inventory. 22. U.S. and global manufacturing, including production that recently shifted out of China to other parts of Asia and to Mexico, took time to recover from disruptions in Chinese supply. Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, and Singapore all have strong supply chain links with China and reported Q1 supply shortages. 23. Even as China's production resumed, these Asian countries grappled with their own COVID-19 outbreaks, further complicating recovery. The situation was exacerbated by spread of COVID-19 in other important manufacturing markets such as South Korea, Italy, Germany, and Mexico. Disruptions in Chinese supply chains were initially expected to have a limited macroeconomic effect on developed markets in the short term, but as the outbreak spread globally and Chinese firms and logistics operations struggled to return to full capacity, a wide range of U.S. imports from China, including raw materials, intermediate industrial inputs, and consumer products faced severe supply constraints. U.S. firms with operations in China or that depend on production in China have begun to consider some diversification away from China and may face further pressure to establish new supply chains. The head of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China said in late February 2020 that the disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic had driven home the need for foreign companies to diversify away from China. 24. In April 2020, the Japanese government earmarked $2.2 billion of a broader economic stimulus package to help companies shift production out of China and to production sites in either Japan or Southeast Asia. In July 2020, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry announced that 87 firms had agreed to shift production out of China and would receive funding, and in September 2020, added India and Bangladesh to its list of eligible alternative production sites. 25. In August 2020, Australia, Japan, and India announced a collaboration to incentivize companies to diversify supply chains from China for economic and geopolitical reasons. 26. Since July 2020, the Chinese government has been reporting instances of the Sarsko V2 virus entering China through the packaging of imported frozen seafood and meat from more than 90 countries. 27. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the World Health Organization have not fully dismissed this possibility, but have indicated that it is extremely unlikely, raising questions about why the Chinese government might be choosing to highlight the issue. 28. The Chinese government has sought to demonstrate that it has successfully suppressed the virus in China and may see benefit in publicizing that new COVID-19 outbreaks in China are tied to imports. Chinese state media have covered the COVID-19 risk assessments related to foreign cold chains, a temperature-controlled supply chain often used for certain food and pharmaceuticals, in support of a broader narrative that aims to challenge other hypotheses by suggesting instead that the initial COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan may have been tied to imported seafood. The timing of China's actions aligns with a new government focus on domestic food security and may aim to improve the government's control over and ability to moderate imports of seafood and meat. 29. China's new government measures involve ad hoc import restrictions, virtual spot checks of overseas factories and food suppliers, and ramped-up testing and inspection requirements. These measures are slowing imports and raising domestic health concerns about foreign seafood and meat. 30. The use of virtual spot checks and corporate interviews and the timing of such measures suggests that the Chinese government also might be using inspections to gain insights into foreign-controlled cold chain storage and distribution expertise and proprietary capabilities in preparation for China's efforts to expand in this area, including the Chinese government's plans to distribute Chinese vaccines globally. In December 2020, Alibaba's logistics arm, Cainiao, announced a partnership with Ethiopian Airlines to operate a global cold chain network out of the Chinese southeastern city of Shenzhen that would be capable of distributing temperature-sensitive medicines globally. 31. 3 Chinese state-tied companies are producing vaccines and negotiating to distribute these vaccines overseas. 1. CanSino Biologics, Inc., a company tied to China's Academy of Military Medical Science and the Wuhan Institute of Virology. 32. 2. Sinovac Biotech, Limited, a company tied to Beijing University Medical College. the Chinese Academy of Medical Sciences, the National Institute for the Control of Pharmaceutical and Biological Products, and the National Institute for Viral Disease Control and Prevention. 33. The company has been penalized for high-profile pharmaceutical corruption cases in the past. 34. And 3. China National Biotechnology Group, also known as Sinopharm, a state company that has 2 different vaccines in development and is also invested in Germany's BioNTech through one of its main shareholders, Shanghai Fosun. Fosun Pharma is the co-owner of Sinopharm Industrial Investment, the parent company of Sinopharm. 35. Chinese state-tied company, Shanghai Fosun Pharmaceutical Group Co., Limited, also known as Fosun Pharma, has a strategic alliance with U.S. company Pfizer Inc.'s COVID-19 vaccine German company partner, BioNTech. The agreement includes an initial purchase of $50 million of BioNTech's shares with the promise of an additional $85 million in investment. Fosun has the commercialization rights to BioNTech's BNT162 vaccine in China. 36. Chinese media outlet Caixin reported in mid-December 2020 that Fosun Pharma will import 7.2 million doses of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in the first half of 2021. 37. Prospects for U.S. exports. U.S. firms' resumption of exports to China has depended on the resumption of global port operations and China's economic recovery. U.S. export recovery to China has been slow and uneven. As part of the Phase 1 trade deal that the United States and China signed in mid-January 2020 to resolve some issues the United States raised under Section 301, the United States and China agreed, effective February 14, 2020, to cut by 50% the tariffs they imposed in September 2019. China announced a tariff exemption process for 700 tariff lines, including some agriculture, medical supplies, raw materials, and industrial inputs. With China's recovery, the U.S. government could press China to make up for lost time on U.S. purchases. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it difficult for both sides to meet these targets, however, given the economic fallout in both countries. China's efforts to diversify import sources for key goods, such as energy and agriculture, have potentially undercut China's capacity to meet its U.S. commitments. 38. China imported 53.18 million tons of crude oil and replenished its strategic petroleum reserves from non-U.S. sources during the March 2020 collapse in global oil prices. 39. The sustained outbreak of African swine flu in China has fueled an uptick in China's pork imports from the United States, but overall agricultural purchases remain below previous years and still fall short of negotiated targets. As part of the Phase 1 trade deal, China committed to purchase at least $200 billion above a 2017 baseline amount of U.S. agriculture, $32 billion. Energy, $52.4 billion. Manufacturing goods, $77.7 billion. And services, $37.9 billion. Between January 1, 2020 and December 31, 2021. 40. Regarding agriculture, in November 2019, China's National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, announced detailed rules for the application and allocation of grain and cotton import tariff rate quotas for 2020 that specify imports for wheat, 9.636 million tons, 90% state-owned trade. Corn, 7.2 million tons, 60% state-owned trade. Rice, 5.32 million tons, 50% state trade. And cotton, 894,000 tons, 33% state-owned trade. 41. These tariff rate quotas appear to remain unchanged for 2021. 42. NDRC included in these rules a requirement that companies applying for tariff rate quotas must have a positive record in China's corporate social credit system. 43. This requirement allows the Chinese government to restrict or impose terms on certain U.S. cotton exporters. China could use this requirement to create counter-pressure in response to recent U.S. congressional and executive branch actions to block U.S. imports of textiles and apparel that contain cotton from China's Xinjiang region due to concerns over forced labor there. 44. With falling oil prices, China would arguably have to buy a significant larger volume of goods to reach its purchase obligations that are benchmarked by dollar value. Force majeure provisions. The crisis also called into question China's ability to fully implement the U.S.-China Phase 1 trade deal signed in January 2020. The agreement has a force majeure provision, which allows parties to opt out of contractual obligations without legal penalty because of developments beyond their control, that could give China flexibility in implementing its commitments. 45. The deal was finalized in December 2019 and signed in mid-January 2020, when Chinese officials reportedly knew about the severity of the COVID-19 outbreak in Wuhan, which may raise questions about the rationale and timing of the decision to include the force majeure provision. A factor further complicating the potential for resumption and expansion of U.S. exports is Chinese companies' invocation of force majeure certifications. For example, China National Petroleum Company (CNPC) used the outbreak of COVID-19 to declare force majeure in canceling some liquefied natural gas (LNG) imports, a move followed by a downturn in overall oil and gas demand. The Ministry of Commerce has since provided certifications to Chinese companies that need to declare force majeure. 46. Chinese companies and courts rely on an interpretation of force majeure that is different from the standard legal interpretation in the United States, which allows both parties to cancel contract terms and revert to a pre-contract baseline. In China, force majeure is used to cancel an obligation by the party invoking the provision while the other party may still be obligated to perform and honor contract terms. For example, if a payment is blocked or forgiven by the Chinese government, the other party may still be expected to perform according to the contract terms without the foreign party being reimbursed for any additional costs incurred. Moreover, Chinese courts are unlikely to allow foreign firms to prosecute Chinese firms that do not perform according to their contracts. 47. U.S. reliance on China for health care and medical products. In the midst of the pandemic, Congress has expressed a strong interest in responding to U.S. shortages of medical supplies, including PPE and pharmaceuticals, as the United States steps up efforts to contain and counter the COVID-19 pandemic with limited domestic stockpiles and constraints on U.S. industrial capacity. Because of China's role as a major U.S. and global supplier of medical PPE, medical devices, antibiotics, and active pharmaceutical ingredients, appendix, reduced exports from China led to shortages of critical medical supplies in the United States. 48. While some analysts and industry groups have pointed to tariffs as a disincentive to U.S. imports of health and medical products, supply shortages due to the sharp spike in demand, as well as the nationalization and diversion of supply to China, appear to have been stronger drivers. According to China Customs data, in 2019 China exported $9.8 billion in medical supplies and $7.4 billion in organic chemicals, a figure that includes active pharmaceutical ingredients and antibiotics, to the United States. While there are no internationally agreed guidelines and standards for classifying these products, U.S. imports of pharmaceuticals, medical equipment and products, and related supplies are estimated to have been approximately $20.7 billion, or 9.2% of U.S. imports. According to CRS calculations using official U.S. data, see Figure 2 and Table 1. This number likely understates the extent to which the United States relies on China for pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, products, and supplies. Some foreign products may contain Chinese inputs or components, which may or may not have been substantially transformed in other countries. However, they may not always be classified as Chinese in origin when imported into the United States. This is due, in part, to the substantial transformation test used by U.S. Customs and Border Protection (CBP) to determine a product's country of origin for trade purposes, which some consider to be complex, fact-specific, and subject to interpretation on a case-by-case basis that can be inconsistent and subjective. 49. Additionally, there have been reported cases of Chinese origin products being declared as non-Chinese in origin upon their importation into the United States. For example, firms in other countries importing products from China and relabeling them for export to the United States to avoid tariffs. 50. This number also likely understates U.S. API imports from China because U.S. direct and indirect imports of API from China may not be classified for such manufacturing use when imported into the United States. Figure 2. U.S. imports of pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, products, and supplies in 2019. Notes: the shares presented here cover product categories at the HTS 6-digit level. China's 9.2% share of U.S. imports likely understates the extent to which the United States relies on China for pharmaceuticals and medical equipment, products, and supplies because of how these imports are classified. Table 1. Select U.S. imports from China in 2019. Value U.S. dollars and share of U.S. imports %. While the United States depends on China for low-end PPE and API, the United States depends more on Europe and select Asian countries for high-end medical products. The United States is a global leader in advanced medical equipment and pharmaceutical innovation, areas where China is seeking to gain ground through its industrial policies. Figure 3. Figure 3. U.S. import and exports of select medical products in 2019. China nationalizes medical production and supply. In early February 2020, the Chinese government nationalized control of the production and dissemination of medical supplies in China. Concerned about shortages and its ability to contain COVID-19, the Chinese government transferred authority over the production and distribution of medical supplies from the Ministry of Information Industry and Technology, MIIT, to the NDRC, China's powerful Central Economic Planning Ministry. NDRC commandeered medical manufacturing and logistics down to the factory level and directed the production and distribution of all medical-related production, including U.S. companies' production lines in China, for domestic use. 51. In response to government directives, foreign firms with significant production capacity in China, including 3M, Foxconn, and General Motors, shifted significant elements of their operations to manufacturing medical PPE. 52. By late February 2020, China had ramped up face mask production, both basic surgical masks and N95 masks, from a baseline of 20 million a day to over 100 million a day. China's nationalization efforts, while understandable as part of its efforts to address an internal health crisis, may have denied the United States and other countries that depend on open and free markets for their healthcare supply chains timely access to critical medical supplies. See Table 2 and Table 3. 53. On February 3, 2020, China's Ministry of Commerce directed its bureaucracy, local governments and industry to secure critical technology, medical supplies, and medical-related raw material inputs from the global market. 54. A situation that likely further exacerbated supply shortages in the United States and other markets. To ensure sufficient domestic supplies to counter COVID-19, China's Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, also called on its regional offices in China and overseas to work with PRC industry associations to prioritize securing supplies from global sources and importing these products. The Ministry of Commerce provided a list of 51 medical suppliers and distributors in 14 countries and regions to target in quickly assuring supply. The ministry also prioritized food security and the need to increase meat imports. 55. China's trade data shows that these policies led to steep increases in China's imports of essential PPE and medical supplies, including the raw materials needed to make products such as N95 masks. The policies also contributed to sharp decreases in China's exports of these critical medical products to the world. See Table 2. On March 29, 2020, the Australian government imposed new temporary restrictions on all foreign investment proposals in Australia out of concern that strategic investors, particularly those of Chinese origin, might target distressed assets. This came after authorities discovered 2 instances of Chinese property developers in Australia purchasing large volumes of medical supplies and precious metals for shipment to China. 56. Risland, a wholly owned subsidiary of one of China's largest property developers, Country Garden Holdings, reportedly shipped 82 tons of medical supplies from Australia to China on February 24, 2020. The shipment included 100,000 medical gowns and 900,000 pairs of gloves. 57. Greenland Australia, a subsidiary of another large Chinese property developer backed by the Chinese government, Greenland Group, implemented instructions from the Chinese government to secure bulk supplies of medical items from the global market. Greenland reportedly sourced from Australia and other countries 3 million protective masks, 700,000 hazmat suits, and 500,000 pairs of gloves for export to China over several weeks in January and February 2020. 58. Table 2. Change in China's exports and imports of select medical products. January to February 2019 versus January to February 2020. Notes: N95 and other protective masks have historically been classified under tariff subheading 6307.99.9889, which includes other miscellaneous textile article made from similar materials. Table 3. U.S. imports from China in 2019, COVID-19 related medical supplies. 2019 value US dollars. 2019 share of U.S. imports %, and change from 2018 %. Notes: the International Harmonized System (HS) for classifying goods is a 6-digit code system, and classification at the 8 and 10-digit levels varies by country. The figures presented here may overestimate the actual value of U.S. imports of medical products, as it is not always possible to identify specific, individual products even at the most disaggregated level. Implications of China's export constraints, U.S. shortages and policy response. As the United States ramped up efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19, reduced production and exports of pharmaceuticals and PPE from China exacerbated shortages of critical medical supplies. Minnesota-based 3M, a large-scale manufacturer of N95 respirators, for example, told the New York Times in spring 2020 that all masks manufactured at its Shanghai factory were sold to meet China's domestic demand. Other mask manufacturers, such as Canada's Medicom, stated that the Chinese government had not yet authorized them to export PPE. 59. China's Ministry of Commerce claimed it was not imposing export restrictions on medical supplies. 60. But this statement may not apply to the situation in which all of China's domestic production was controlled by the government and geared toward domestic consumption. Subsequently, China's imposition of new export quality checks for PPE, particularly masks, implemented by China's National Medical Products Administration, NMPA, further slowed exports. On March 30, 2020, China's Ministry of Commerce, MOFCOM, announced new qualifications for medical supply exports. 61. It announced that all medical supplies related to COVID-19 would need to obtain qualifications from China's National Medical Products Administration, NMPA. These new requirements appeared aimed at addressing faulty PPE that several foreign government buyers found in large PPE shipments from China. By requiring new certification processes, the measures also appear to have slowed legitimate exports. Even companies producing in China for export that already had FDA approval had to meet these new PRC requirements. 62. Related to MOFCOM's announcement, on March 30, 2020, NMPA issued regulatory requirements and standards for coronavirus testing reagents and protective products. These new requirements regulated COVID-19 testing reagents as Class 3 medical equipment, highest risk level, and regulated medical use masks and protective gear as Class 2 medical equipment, requiring producers to obtain licenses from provincial-level regulators prior to production. The NMPA classified regular masks and protective goggles as Class 1 medical equipment, requiring producers to file with local authorities. The NMPA also released registration information for 7 COVID-19 products: testing kits, ventilators, medical protective wares, medical protective masks, medical surgical masks, single-use masks, and infrared thermometers detectors. 63. In addition to these new registration and inspection requirements, some U.S. legal experts observed that China may have used informal measures, such as administrative guidance, to prioritize exports to certain countries ahead of the United States. 64. This may have been politically motivated, as China orchestrated publicized PPE deliveries to countries such as Serbia and Italy, which have signed on to China's One Belt, One Road initiative and whom China sees as important partners for investment and trade initiatives in Europe. 65. China organized a range of government-to-government medical supply agreements around the world that sought to emphasize the importance of relations with China and the government's goodwill, but ran into problems with many governments due to faulty PPE. In April and May 2020, Canada's Public Health Authority reported extensive problems with KN95 respirator masks from China that were counterfeit or otherwise failed to meet federal COVID-19 standards for medical use. 66. Several European countries, including the Netherlands and Spain, reported faulty masks and COVID-19 test kits. 67. Chinese propaganda efforts tied to the delivery of PPE were criticized in Western media and by European Union officials as trying to capitalize on the crisis to try and divide Europe. Chinese media frequently conflated Chinese government-organized and publicized shipments of PPE that had been procured and paid for by foreign governments as aid. 68. China's exports of COVID-19-related PPE experienced a sharp uptick between March and June 2020, before tapering off in July with a particularly pronounced increase in N95 masks and other made-up textiles that peaked earlier than other products. China appears to have prioritized Europe in its export of N95 masks, a trend that is reflected both in overall increases and shifts in market share as a percentage of total imports. China's market share as a percentage of EU imports of N95 masks rose by 15 percentage points in March and October 2020, compared to the same period in 2019, while its share of U.S. imports declined by 13 percentage points. See Table 4. China's market share for N95 masks in Japan, Australia, and South Korea also declined somewhat. Figure 4. China's export of select COVID-19-related products, January to October 2020. Notes: changes in the value of trade are determined by both the quantity of trade and the price of the good. Many of these products experienced an increase in both price and quantity during the March to July 2020 period. In defining these product groups, CRS has attempted to capture the most common HS categorizations for these items. However, some trade of these items may have been exported under additional HS codes not reflected here, and, conversely, the product groups are not exclusive to COVID-19 related gear and may include other similar trade. EU 27 includes the 27 member states of the European Union, excluding the United Kingdom. UAE is the United Arab Emirates. Figure 5. China's exports of select COVID-19 related products. Comparison of March to October 2019 and March to October 2020. Notes: changes in the value of trade are determined by both the quantity of trade and the price of the good. Many of these products experienced an increase in both price and quantity during the 2020 period. For definitions of the product categories and other caveats, see the notes of Table 4. Table 4. Top partners. Value of China's exports of select COVID-19 related medical goods. Comparison of the March to October 2019 and March to October 2020. Notes: changes in the value of trade are determined by both the quantity of trade and the price of the good. Many of these products experienced an increase in both price and quantity during the March to July 2020 period. In defining these product groups, CRS has attempted to capture the most common HS categorizations for these items. However, some trade of these items may have been exported under additional HS codes not reflected here, and, conversely, the product groups are not exclusive to COVID-19 related gear and may include other similar trade. See footnotes for specific product classifications. EU 27 includes the 27 member states of the European Union, excluding the United Kingdom. UAE is the United Arab Emirates. HS 630,790 is a higher-level classification that includes N95 masks among other types of made-up textile articles not classified elsewhere. B. Other face and IPPE is defined as HS 392,690, 481,890, 900,490, and 902,000. C. Gowns and other PPE are defined as HS 392,620, 401,590, 481,850, 621,010, 621,040, 621,050, and 650,500. D. PPE gloves are defined as HS 392,620, 401,511, 401,519, 611,610, and 621,600. E. COVID-19 test kits and instructions are defined as HS 300,215, 382,100, 382,200, and 902,780. U.S. shortages. U.S. national and state-level health authorities began reporting shortages of medical supplies, including PPE such as gowns and face masks, in February 2020. On March 18, 2020, President Trump issued Executive Order 13,909, prioritizing and allocating health and medical resources to respond to the spread of COVID-19, which announced the President's invocation of the Defense Production Act of 1950 (DPA). In response to the COVID-19 pandemic. 69 The DPA confers broad presidential authorities to mobilize domestic industry in service of the national defense, defined in statute as various military activities in homeland security, stockpiling, space, and any directly related activity. 50 U.S.C. Section 4552, including emergency preparedness activities under the Stafford Act, which has been used for public health emergencies. 70. Among other authorities, Title I of the DPA allows the President to require persons, including businesses and corporations, to 1. Prioritize and accept government contracts for materials and services, and 2. Allocate or control the general distribution of materials, services, and facilities as necessary to promote the national defense. The administration, however, is only publicly providing limited direction to the private sector under this authority. 71. The use of the DPA to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic required some amount of time to produce adequate supplies, considering the large volumes of products, particularly PPE and ventilators, which were in urgent demand. Many U.S. firms are typically hesitant to invest in substantial increases in production, including obtaining the capital equipment and other inputs required, until they have a guaranteed buyer and price. 72. Manufacturing firms, such as General Motors, Ford Motor Company, and Tesla repurposed factory production for ventilators, but, as defense logistics experts projected, these types of efforts took months. 73. Additionally, in the United States, PPE and ventilators for use in the healthcare setting are considered medical devices and require marketing permission from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration (FDA). 74. The Trump administration's relatively late formal invocation and activation of the DPA, which could have effectively served as an export constraint on U.S.-produced medical supplies, arguably left discretion to U.S. companies to decide whether to fill export or domestic orders first. By contrast, governments in Taiwan, Thailand, France, and Germany boosted production but restricted exports, further curtailing U.S. supply options. In January and February 2020, organizers of U.S. private sector relief efforts reportedly purchased large amounts of U.S. PPE products for airlift to China, further depleting U.S. supplies. 75. Some members of Congress have called for broader tariff relief or at least new exclusions for existing tariffs and a moratorium on any new tariffs. Other members and U.S. domestic producers argue that such liberalization could open the U.S. market to a flood of imports during an economic downturn. 76. The Office of the United States Trade Representative (USTR) announced on March 6, 2020, that it would lift tariffs imposed under Section 301 authorities on 19 specific products and 8 10-digit subheadings of medical supply and equipment items from China. See Table 5. 77. The USTR announced on March 20, 2020, that, prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, the agency had been working with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to ensure that critical medicines and other essential medical products were not subject to additional Section 301 tariffs. Consequently, the United States had not imposed tariffs on certain critical products, such as ventilators, oxygen masks, and nebulizers. The USTR indicated that it had prioritized the review of requests for exclusions on medical care products, resulting in exclusions granted on basic medical supplies, including gloves, soaps, face masks, surgical drapes, and hospital gowns. Since March 2020, the USTR has exempted certain medical products from Section 301 tariffs in several rounds of exclusions. CRS could not determine exactly how many of them have been exempted on the basis of COVID-19 concerns, as the USTR does not specify the rationale for granting exclusions in its announcements. While CRS can identify some products, there are others with known or potential medical uses, or inputs for the manufacture thereof, that have received exclusions but whose ultimate purpose cannot always be ascertained from HTSUS subheadings or the provided product descriptions, for example, organic chemicals or textiles for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals or PPE. In addition, at the end of March 2020, the USTR published a Federal Register notice seeking comments to determine if further modifications to the Section 301 tariffs on U.S. imports from China are necessary to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. The notice provided no further guidance on the types of products that the USTR considers to be medical care products. The review of comments was to run parallel to, and was not to affect, any ongoing product exclusion requests still under review. The USTR has not indicated what form the response would take or when it will respond to comments, only that it will review them on a rolling basis. These comments may already be informing product exclusion decisions, or may lead to the establishment of a new formal exclusion process, akin to that used for lists 3 and 4, but strictly for medical products. The administration appears reluctant to liberalize non-health-related tariffs, preferring to delay tariff payments instead. 78. In late March 2020, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection sent notices to companies saying that officials will approve some delays in tariff payments to offer economic relief due to the severity of COVID-19. They may also be weighing a broader suspension of collecting duties. 79. Separate from COVID-19, with regard to existing tariff exemptions, on March 20, USTR invited industry to submit public comments beginning on April 20, regarding whether USTR should extend certain tariff exclusions on other products already granted in June 2019 that expire in June 2020. 80. USTR undertook selective liberalization but broader liberalization of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods during the COVID-19 outbreak could expose the U.S. economy to Chinese excess industrial capacity at a point of economic downturn in the United States. Chinese firms also could capture market share and gain a unique foothold in the U.S. market through market softening and if the United States were to relax FDA and other product certifications. Table 5. Select Section 301 tariff exclusions on select U.S. imports from China. Value US dollars. And share of U.S. imports percent in 2019. Notes: asterisk only a portion of the HTS 10-digit subheading is covered by the tariff exclusion. For more detail, see 85 FR 15244. N95 and other protective masks have historically been classified under tariff subheading 6307.99.9889, which includes other miscellaneous textile article made from similar materials. In an effort to quickly bring overseas medical supplies into the United States, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, announced on March 29, 2020 that it was arranging an airlift for 22 flights, most from Asia, over the subsequent 2 weeks. The airlift was for medical supplies that medical distributors already planned to import into the United States, but it accelerated their delivery arrival time by shipping by air instead of ocean freight. 81. As of May 2020, FEMA said it had coordinated the delivery of more than 97 million respirators, 133.7 million surgical masks, and 10,600 ventilators, among other critical medical supplies. 82. The trade disruptions due to the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted U.S. and broader global dependence on bulk API from China. In addition to medical supplies specific to COVID-19, the disruption of China's pharmaceutical and medical exports showed the potential impact of China API trade on availability and pricing for common drugs and components for medical devices. According to FDA officials, in 2018, China ranked second among countries that export drugs and biologics to the United States by import line, accounting for 13.4% of U.S. imports of those products. 83. However, FDA states it is not able to determine the volume of APIs that China is manufacturing, given the complexity of the supply chain and gaps in what pharmaceutical companies are required to disclose about their inputs. 84. China is also a leading supplier of APIs in global supply chains for painkillers, diabetes medicines, and antibiotics, meaning a slowdown in API exports from China could increase cost pressures faced by U.S. drug manufacturers. 85. For example, China accounts for 52% of U.S. imports of penicillin, 90% of tetracycline, and 93% of chloramphenicol. 86. On February 27, 2020, FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn announced that a manufacturer of an unspecified human drug informed FDA of a shortage the drug's supply related to a Chinese API manufacturer affected by COVID-19. 87. Because information disclosed to FDA regarding drug shortages is considered proprietary, FDA did not disclose the name of the drug in question, but did note that alternatives exist for patient use. 88. According to congressional testimony delivered in October 2019 by Janet Woodcock, director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, the FDA is unable to estimate the total volume of all API produced in China. Woodcock also stated in her testimony that the FDA was able to identify 3 drugs on the WHO's essential medicines list whose API manufacturers are based only in China: capreomycin and streptomycin, commonly used to treat tuberculosis, and sulfadiazine, used to treat chancroid and trachoma. 89. China exported 10 million tons of bulk API in 2019, a 9% increase over 2018, according to the China Chamber of Commerce for the import and export of medicine and health products. Almost 90% of China's API exports by volume went to Asia, Europe, and North America, including the United States 7%, Europe 20%, India 8%, Southeast Asia 41%, and Japan 5%. Almost 75% of China's API exports by value went to these same markets, including the United States 12%, Europe 28%, India 17%, Southeast Asia 10%, and Japan 6%. The difference between China's API exports by volume and value is particularly noticeable in the case of Southeast Asia, where the volume of API exports are high, but the value is low. Figure 6. Chinese API exports remain relatively disaggregated, with the top 10 Chinese exporters accounting for an estimated 9% of exports in 2019, and the following 43 top exporters accounting for 22% of exports. Chinese industry trade data may not be aggregating data by affiliated firms, which could show higher levels of corporate concentration. Large Chinese API exporters include Sinopharm Group Co., Limited, Paluo Pharmaceutical, Livzon Pharmaceutical Group, Inc., Zhejiang Huahai Pharmaceutical Co., Limited, Zhejiang Chemicals Import and Export Corporation, and Zhejiang Juzhou Pharmaceutical Co., Limited. 90. Another Chinese state-tied API exporter, Harbin Pharmaceutical Group, Co., in August 2020 successfully bid for the U.S. supplements company GNC Holdings Inc.'s assets in bankruptcy proceedings, providing Harbin Pharmaceutical an extensive distribution and retail presence in the United States. 91. GNC said that Harbin Pharmaceutical's earlier strategic stake was approved by CFI-US in 2018, but some members of Congress still pressed for CFI-US to review the new transaction because of their concerns. 92. Figure 6. China's API exports by volume and value 2019. CRS has assessed China's API-related exports in HTS Chapters 29 and 30 at the 6-digit tariff level as reported by China Customs, to better assess specific trends in China's API exports and to verify the trade data that has been reported by China's Industry Association. The CRS assessment comes quite close to Chinese industry reports by trade value. The export market breakdowns using the CRS analysis by value are included below. Figure 7. Figure 7. China's API export destinations based on value 2019. Notes. 1. Europe includes the 27 members of the European Union, Albania, Andorra, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iceland, Moldova, Monaco, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Norway, Russia, Serbia, Switzerland, Ukraine, and the United Kingdom. 2. Southeast Asia includes Brunei Darussalam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. China's role as the primary supplier of APIs to global manufacturers of generic pharmaceuticals, particularly in India, highlights that the U.S. market may be dependent on China API through third markets. Shortages of China's exports of API to India, for example, would likely increase overall costs of generic pharmaceuticals for consumers in the United States. India, which supplies approximately 40% of generic pharmaceuticals used in the United States, imports nearly 70% of its APIs from China. 93. In March 2020, India imposed export restrictions on several drugs whose supply chains rely on China, leading to fears of potential global shortages of generic drugs that have since escalated after India announced a nationwide 21-day lockdown. 94. Additionally, further tensions in China-India bilateral trade resulting from any intensification in the ongoing border tensions between the two countries could pose further risk to generic pharmaceutical supply chains. Global trade restrictions. Amid concerns about the availability of personal protective equipment (PPE), medical supplies, and pharmaceuticals, a growing number of nations applied temporary export controls and other restrictions on the overseas sales of these products. While export controls do not necessarily prohibit export activity, they make export licenses a requirement, which could lead to transactions being delayed and potentially denied or cancelled. As medical professionals around the world scrambled to find gloves, face shields, protective garments, disinfectants, ventilators, and other equipment needed to fight COVID-19, these measures highlighted the risks, and exacerbated the challenges, of relying on complex global supply chains and distribution channels that are not sufficiently diversified. 95. World Trade Organization (WTO) rules prohibit export bans except for rare instances in which a member invokes a measure citing national security concerns. In an effort to promote transparency, the WTO published a list of temporary export bans that countries enact during the COVID-19 pandemic and notify to the WTO. 96. On March 30, 2020, the G20 issued a joint statement that emphasized the importance of keeping markets open and ensuring the adequate production and fair and equitable distribution of medical products to where they are most needed. The statement emphasized that any measures a country might adopt to protect health should be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary. 97. So far this year, China and more than 24 other economies, including India and the European Union, 98. Imposed either limits or formal or de facto bans on certain exports. 99. Many of the measures temporarily restricted access to markets on which the United States depends for certain imports. These included medical ventilators, for which Singapore and China accounted for 35% and 17%, respectively, of U.S. imports in 2019, breathing and gas masks, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy, 47% combined. CT scanners, Germany, 50%. Medical protective equipment of textile materials, China, 72%. Digital and infrared thermometers, China, 36%. Pharmaceuticals, Ireland, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, 53% combined. and tetracycline and penicillin, China, 90% and 52%, respectively. 100. Many governments rescinded these temporary measures after the height of the COVID-19 outbreak in their countries. China did not provide notice of its de facto export constraints that redirected supply for domestic use to the World Trade Organization, WTO, as other countries did. 101. China Customs delays release of January to February 2020 trade data. The Chinese government released top-level import and export figures to the media in early March 2020, but China Customs did not release its detailed January to February 2020 monthly trade data, as scheduled on March 19, 2020 until 11 days later on March 30, 2020. This data is important in providing additional details on trade patterns during the COVID-19 pandemic, including concentrated areas of trade drops, as well as shifting patterns of trade for medical supplies in and out of China. China Customs also delayed data releases in 2018 during the several rounds of U.S. tariffs and PRC counter-tariffs under Section 301, raising questions about the Chinese government's motives and the accuracy of the data eventually released. 102. Analysts assess it as possible that the Chinese government in these cases sought to adjust official trade data to reflect broader policy objectives and minimize any signs of economic or trade downturn. Domestic supply. U.S. versus foreign-made products. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the gaps in U.S. domestic industry and trade data that complicated the ability to assess U.S. domestic capabilities in relation to global supply and trade dependencies for critical products in a time of crisis. 103. In general, the U.S. government does not keep records of the domestic production of specific, individual items, for example, surgical masks and gloves, by quantity or value, and the U.S. government also does not track how much of this production is ultimately destined for the U.S. market. 104. Of what the United States produces domestically, the U.S. government tracks categories of products that are exported to foreign markets. It also collects statistics for broad industry sectors, such as gross output, value added, also known as gross domestic product (GDP), by industry, and intermediate inputs. 105. Another complicating factor in the analysis of U.S. production, and U.S. reliance on imports, of PPE and medical products is that there are no domestic or internationally agreed guidelines, standards, or definitions of what specific products make up these categories. Therefore, questions such as, how much PPE does the United States currently produce relative to what it imports? Or, by how much has domestic production of pharmaceuticals increased since the COVID-19 outbreak, are difficult to answer. 106. However, data from an annual government survey of U.S. manufacturers, analyzed in conjunction with official U.S. trade statistics, may give a partial insight into some domestic production activities and provide a rough estimate of the share that imported PPE and medical products account for of total U.S. supply. Annual Survey of Manufacturers and Trade Statistics. The U.S. Census Bureau's Annual Survey of Manufacturers (ASM) measures current U.S. manufacturing activities such as industry outputs, inputs, and operating status. 107. It provides sample estimates of statistics for manufacturing establishments in the United States based on the North American Industry Classification System, NAICS. 108. The ASM statistics include the value added by manufacturing, total value of shipments for close to 1,400 classes of manufactured products, costs of materials, and inventories. NAICS categories capture most, but not necessarily all, establishments producing PPE and medical products. However, there is a time lag with the data, which presents challenges in developing a real-time picture of the industry, as 2018 is the most recent year for which data are available. 109. In addition, the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis (BEA) and the Census Bureau collect data on U.S. imports on a monthly, quarterly, and yearly basis. 110. Using these data, and matching them with the ASM, CRS was able to obtain a rough estimate of the imported, and thereby infer the domestic, share of U.S. supply for categories considered to include PPE, pharmaceuticals, and other medical-related products in 2018 Table 6. The figures were calculated at the NAICS 6-digit subheading level, the most disaggregated level for which NAICS data are available. However, because these are broad categories, the data may underestimate or overestimate actual domestic production and imports. 111. Estimates suggest that the United States seems to be heavily dependent on certain imports for more than 90% of domestic supply in some cases. However, foreign source dependence varies by product category. In 2018, the United States imported many low-end and labor-intensive manufactured products primarily from China, for example, apparel from fabrics such as hospital gowns. Many of the higher value-added and skill-intensive imported products, on the other hand, came mainly from Europe, for example, irradiation machines and biological products such as vaccines. Table 6. Estimate of the imported share of U.S. domestic supply. Select medical-related manufactured good categories in 2018. Share of domestic supply, %. Notes. 1. Shares are rough estimates calculated at the NAICS 6-digit subheading level, which may cover products that are not for medical use. 2. 2018 is the most recent year for which annual data from the ASM are available. 3. Asterisk equals share of domestic supply is less than 0.05%. And 4. Descriptions in brackets are only select examples of products or items covered by the NAICS subheading. This picture, however, may have changed between 2018 and 2020 as China capitalized on the investments that the government has made in recent years to push ahead on ambitious state-led programs such as Made in China 2025, MIC 2025. 112. One of the goals of MIC 2025 is to modernize the Chinese economy and turn China into a global leader in the manufacturing of biopharmaceuticals and high-performance medical devices. Lack of data and other constraints limit the U.S. ability to assess in real time the progress of these efforts and their impact on the U.S. economy and industrial base. Other sources of data and information. Sizing up the U.S. government's reliance on foreign goods faces similar challenges in data limitations. 113. The U.S. General Services Administration (GSA) maintains a database, the Federal Procurement Data System Next Generation (FPDS-NG), or FPDS, where federal agencies are required to report procurement contracts whose estimated value is $10,000 or more. 114. The procurement data in FPDS-NG are not fully reliable. There are documented quality issues documented relating to accuracy, completeness, and timeliness of its data. 115. These limitations have prompted many analysts to rely on FPDS-NG data primarily to identify broad trends and produce rough estimates, or to gather information about specific contracts. With these limitations in mind, FPDS-NG data may provide general information regarding the value, quantity, and types of domestic and foreign-made goods U.S. government agencies procure. Other information on domestic capacity, as well as changes resulting from increased production in the aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreak, generally comes from private research firms, news outlets, and trade associations. Many of the figures cited are often based on surveys, firms' press releases, or firms' industries' forecasts, which may differ significantly from actual production. China's economic recovery, prospects and implications. China's leaders have focused on resuming manufacturing production to jumpstart economic growth. 116. At an executive session of China's cabinet, the State Council, on March 17, 2020, Chinese officials emphasized the importance of stabilizing employment and announced that the government would streamline business approvals and fast-track approvals for large infrastructure projects. They also offered government support to alleviate shortages of labor, raw materials, funds, and protective gear. 117. To facilitate economic activity, the Chinese government also appears to have liberalized company health requirements and lifted intra-provincial and intra-city travel and transportation restrictions. NDRC spokesperson Meng Wei said on March 17, 2020 that transportation was operating normally. Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Shanghai were operating at close to 100% of normal capacity, and over 90% of large-scale industrial companies outside of Hubei had resumed production. 118. Company reports of opening and resumption of operations did not necessarily mean that these facilities were fully online or operating at pre-crisis levels, however. Several economic analysts and news outlets, including the Financial Times, published alternative measures of business resumption rates using proxies for economic activity, such as data on traffic congestion, air pollution levels, and container freight movement. Overall, many of these measures suggested that businesses across China did not return to full capacity at the rates reported by local and provincial governments. 119. In Wuhan, the center of the original outbreak, the Hubei provincial government issued a notice in March that applies to Wuhan as Hubei's capital, allowing certain companies to resume work ahead of other production. This included companies in the medical and health industry, as well as companies producing protective gear, disinfectant, daily necessities, agriculture, and products critical to national and global supply chains. 120. China emerged in June 2020 as the first major country to announce a return to economic growth since the outbreak of COVID-19, but consumption lagged production recovery and the economic recovery has relied on government spending and exports to boost growth. The government reported 3.2% gross domestic product (GDP) growth in the second quarter and 4.9% GDP growth in the third quarter of 2020. 121. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) projects China's economy to grow by 1.9% in 2020. China since February 2020 has provided an estimated $506 billion in stimulus and increased the government's budget deficit target to a record high of 3.6% of GDP, up from 2.8% in 2019. Shifting from efforts to reduce debt, the government announced the issuance of $142.9 billion of special treasury bonds for the first time since 2007, increased the quota for local government special bonds, a source of infrastructure funding, and fast-tracked issuance of corporate bonds to cover pandemic costs, but with potential broader uses. The IMF estimates that the fiscal measures and financing plans announced amounted to 4.1% of the China's GDP, as of July 2020. 122. China's National Bureau of Statistics in November 2020 recorded a 5% year-on-year increase in retail sales, a 2.6% year-on-year increase in fixed asset investment, and a 7% year-on-year increase in value-added industrial output. The largest growth in investment in industrial output growth, however, was recorded in non-ferrous metals and real estate investment, not broader areas of domestic consumption. 123. China positioning to export. China's economy depends on exports and the foreign exchange it earns through exports, as well as on the large productive role that foreign firms play in the domestic market and as exporters. Seeking to stabilize drops in foreign investment and trade, on March 12, Commerce Vice Minister Wang Shaowen held a call with 400 members of the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and on March 13, he held a similar webinar with the European Chamber of Commerce in China's Advisory Council. Vice Minister Wang pressed companies to reopen operations and increase investments in China. Other Chinese agencies represented included NDRC, MIIT, the National Health Commission, the General Administration of Drug Supervision, the State Administration for Market Regulation, the General Administration of Customers, the Civil Aviation Administration of China, the Ministry of Transportation, and the State Taxation Administration. 124. During past crises, such as the global financial crisis of 2008-09, China has pressed firms to idle facilities and keep them production-ready instead of shuttering them, and retain workers instead of laying them off to maintain social stability and facilitate efforts to quickly ramp up production and exports later. 125. These stimulus efforts are sometimes less visible than fiscal policies in other countries. Several market watchers have noted that, while a 17% drop in Chinese exports in January to February 2020 was significant, it was not as dramatic when considering China's economy was shuttered for much of February. This indicates that Chinese industry may have had sufficient stock already at ports for export when the crisis hit. This also signals how China was able to resume an export push in the third quarter of 2020. 126. China's economic recovery has been important to the United States and the global economy, as it is an important center of demand and supply. At the same time, during this period of global economic downturn, the United States and other countries are now potentially vulnerable to a concerted PRC export push that has been expanding since summer 2020 and any effort China makes to take additional market share in strategic sectors.